Thank you, Eric and team, for leading us in worship. Yeah, what a great reminder of God's faithfulness. And is it possible to turn the lights up just a little bit more so I can see actually who's that there are people out here today? Because I realized that when we built this building, we never put any windows in this room, and that was for a reason, but it has a downside in that there's no light in it sometimes when you actually want to see people. Thank you. So my name is Brian Johnson. If you haven't met me, I know I haven't met many of you, and I'll let you introduce yourself.
And I'm Cheryl. I'm the other face you can blame.
That's right. Yeah, thank you, Anthony, for that wonderful introduction. Appreciate that a lot. And I am actually looking forward, when Anthony invited us to share some foundational stories of this church, which began quite a few years ago now. Cheryl and I actually had a conversation. We wondered, how would we do that? Because one of the things that we don't want to be is what? Nostalgic. Yeah, I know. We didn't cue all this, but because nostalgia is not usually very accurate nor helpful, right? And when you get to be my age, it's easy to become nostalgic, and we don't want to do that. But history is important. What do you do for a living?
I used to teach history.
Yeah, so if I ever diss history, we have a conversation. And history is important because one of the things that we all realize sooner or later is that history has a way of creeping into the present, whether we like it or not, right? And so after praying and thinking about how we would approach this, and Anthony has given us like 3 Sundays over the summer, so we thought about reflecting on stories of how God formed this church by focusing on 3 seasons of its early life. And so the first season is Hope as an infant. And Hope was an infant, and we're going to talk about that today. There's the infant Hope. We were such a cute little church back then. And then we're going to go in July, we're going to talk about Hope's crazy childhood, which also was a really, really fun season, but really messy, really kind of chaotic. And then we're going to talk about Hope as an adolescent in August. Now, just like each of us, people go through these stages of life. The seasons of a church are kind of developmental as well. And as we talk about Hope's infancy today, we're going to really be talking about the DNA of this church when it was initially conceived. And then next month we'll talk about Hope's crazy childhood, which was a messy, fun time. Some of you were here for that, but many of you were not. And then in August, we're going to focus on a challenging season of Hope's life, which was adolescence. And, some important things happen during adolescence. You become differentiated sort of from your origin, and you really kind of confirm and take responsibility for who you are, for your identity. And so our hope is that this will be fun. That's our intent. But even more, we hope that this will be an encouraging time. It will be a time of God honoring, because Jesus, who formed this church initially, who conceived it initially, continues to shape it and form it and call it into its mission as his beloved bride. And we very firmly believe that. So today we're going to look at Hope as an infant. A few of you were here for that, but not very many of you. And that's understandable. Hope Covenant was conceived in the summer of love, which was 2003. You guys don't really recognize that as the summer of love for some reason. But anyway, 2003, here's what happened. For 13 years, Cheryl and I had served a wonderful church in north central Kansas, where all of our kids grew up. We have 3 children, and they were really all raised in that church. We spent a year starting a church in California, quite a while ago. And then we spent, after we concluded in our church in northern Kansas, we were called to Minneapolis, near where I grew up actually, Minneapolis, Minnesota, where we spent 4 years planting another church. And our kids were graduating from high school during those years, and we realized that none of them were actually settling in Minnesota. They were all ending up back in Kansas, and so we began to talk with the Covenants Midwest Conference, which is sort of the group of churches that coordinate ministry in Kansas, about planting another church in this area, in Kansas somewhere. And we didn't know where. We kind of knew the culture. We had connections in Kansas, but we didn't know what town God might be leading us to. And then somebody pointed us toward this community of El Dorado, which we had heard about but had never actually been to. And so we drove here for a visit. We walked a number of the neighborhoods. We prayed through the community. We talked to several pastors. We did some demographic studies, and we took pictures of, I think, almost every church in town. We drive around, we see a church, we take a picture of it, and just to kind of get a sense of the community. And then we prayed, and we were sensing that God might be calling us to plant a church in this community where we had never been before, and where we knew how many people? We knew no people. I mean, nobody. I mean, it's crazy. You think about it. Cheryl will tell you kind of a little bit about how we ended up here.
One of our visits here, we went for an evening walk, which we often do, but we walked on top of the dam, and there was benches there at that time, and we sat on a bench and watched some guy water skiing, and we turned around, and the sunset was behind us in beautiful colors, and the water was lovely, and we looked at each other and said, it's kind of a no-brainer, isn't it? And we decided to come. What did you used to call it? God...
Holy Spirit-induced temporary insanity.
Yeah. It started at that moment. We kind of gave an ultimatum to God that if He wanted us to move here, we needed to sell our house in Minnesota, as well as so many other things that had to happen. But our house actually sold in 36 hours up there. And so we bought a house.
Which was terrifying. Now, we weren't like 25-year-olds at this point. We were 43, empty nesters. So we had a little bit of freedom, but we were old enough to not do things that were stupid. Now, we moved to El Dorado, bought a house, and began doing prayer walks through the community. And because we knew nobody, we had to find somebody who might be, sharing a vision that we thought God was giving us. And so once we prayed through a community, we did something that was absolutely terrifying. If you know Cheryl and I, you know that we're generally introverts, and yet this is something that we had to do, and Cheryl will tell you what we did.
We started knocking on people's doors. And it was interesting. It was actually a really, really good thing to do. We couldn't invite them to anything. We didn't have anything to invite them to. We weren't going and saying, hey, you want to come to church? We didn't have a church. And so we knocked on the doors. And by the way, we knocked on about 100 doors. And I have a notepad at home somewhere where I made notes of different places that we stopped at and conversations we had. But we asked them, if you don't have a church home, and if you were looking for a church, what would be most important to you? It was a non-threatening question, actually. We never had a door slammed in our face. We had amazing conversations with people that I still, 18 years later, remember when I drive by homes of places that we talked to. But we just asked them, what would be the most important thing to you?
And what did we hear over and over again?
Over and over again, we heard, we want a church where there are no insiders and outsiders. We want a place where everyone is treated the same. We learned there was a lot of hurt in the community put on them by churches, sadly enough. And that was what became our mission, to create a place where there were no insiders and no outsiders.
I think that's something that isn't unique to the El Dorado community, by the way. The division between those who have belonged to a church community and those who have been outside the church community. It's profound. It was profound 18 years ago. It's even more profound today. And so that's what we're going to talk about here. I guess I'm going to talk about it from here on. I appreciate Cheryl just kind of helping tell the story during these early years. So that's sort of the impetus. That's how Hope Covenant was conceived. And this value of being a place where there are no insiders or outsiders was foundational to the DNA that God has sort of embedded into this vision for the new church. The Apostle Paul writes in his letter to the Romans, he starts with these words. He says, Paul, a servant of Jesus Christ, called. Paul was called. And then I'm going to skip down a couple verses. And he says, we received grace and apostleship to call people from among the Gentiles to the obedience that comes from faith. And then he says this, and you also are among those who are called to belong to Jesus Christ. And I want to just kind of latch on to that phrase there that Paul begins his letter to the Romans with, that Jesus calls us to belong. That is really the core of the gospel, isn't it? That Jesus has called us to belong to him, to his family, to each other, to this new community that he is redeeming and restoring for our broken world. Sin has made our relationship with God awkward. Maybe that's a mild word. Maybe even impossible in some ways. Certainly distant. That's what sin does. It alienates us from God. But that brokenness also spills over to relationships with each other as well. And we see that in our world today. We saw it in El Dorado 18 years ago. There was just a fracture among people in the community. There were so many insiders and so many outsiders. But Jesus died to reconcile us to God and to each other. Because of the cross, because of what Jesus did for us on the cross, each of us, imperfect and broken people, are called to fully belong to God and to fully belong to his new community, which takes expression in his church. This is the good news. This is the gospel, that we can belong to God and each other, that we can have relationships that are restored and being made new because of what Jesus has done. So, Jesus calls us to belong. Cheryl and I were talking to so many people 18 years ago who didn't belong, who felt like they were outside of what God was doing, or certainly outside of what the community of Jesus was in this community. It was clear that the DNA of this church, which didn't even have a name at that point, the DNA had to be different. This community that was being conceived, this church that was being born, had to be a place where everybody could belong, where everybody would matter. And we took that seriously. Here's how seriously we took that. This is a mailer that we sent out during the first year of Hope Covenant. I think, yeah, there you go. I don't know why we picked this picture. Just found it and thought, okay, let's use it. But it worked out pretty good for the infancy of the church. This went to thousands of mailboxes in this community. Some of you may have received it, 17 years ago. We were an infant church with a message that here is a place where you can start over with God. On the back of the card, there was some fine print. And one of the things that we put on the back of the card is listed this foundational value that this is a place where there are no insiders or outsiders. It's super easy, by the way, to write values on a card. Really is. Took about 3 seconds to type that into the text. It's much more challenging to actually embody that and live it out in real life, right? It just is. In April of 2004, we held our very first monthly preview worship service down at the Civic Center. This is one of those rare photos of our very first service of Hope Covenant. There were a few people from the community that showed up, quite a few actually, and then we stacked the deck with a bunch of my friends from other places in Kansas. So we had a number of people in this group, and it was a fun service. We met some new people, and we met some gatherers who were hungry for the kind of place that we had kind of espoused in our vision that morning. By the end of that summer, we did a monthly preview for 5 months. And by the end of that summer, there were over 80 people from the community who called Hope Covenant their new church home. Now, the question was, would our DNA hold? Could we really be a church where there were no insiders or outsiders? Is that even biblical? I mean, think about it. Now, certainly Jesus calls us to become transformed, right? He calls us to become his people. And there is this discipling, track that he invites us into. But for the first year or so, it was pretty easy to live into this DNA that there were no insiders or outsiders. Daryl, you were there, right? Lynn, you were there. I mean, there was this wonderful sense that everybody was an insider because there weren't, we hadn't been around long enough to everybody was an outsider, I should say. There were no insiders. And so it was pretty easy to live into our DNA. I remember in the fall of 2004, just 6 months after our very first service, we had an all-church picnic and a bonfire at the home of one of our members who was out in the country. And everybody showed up. I mean, it was amazing. Young and old, people with money, people with very little money, longtime believers in Jesus, and people who were just new to exploring who Jesus was. And I remember standing around this bonfire, Cheryl and I, and about 90 other people, and a ton of children. And there was this sense of energy, but this sense of family, that God was doing this new thing, that we all were part of this family because the ground at the foot of the cross is level. It's really one of my most vivid memories in 30-some years of ministry, that God had called this together. We had no history. It was the gospel. It was this call of Jesus to belong that had brought us all around that bonfire that night. Here's the thing. Infants don't stay infants for long. They don't, stay those cute little easy to care for infants long. They start crawling and they start needing bigger diapers and they start toddling. And as Hope Covenant grew into its toddler stage of life, we began to feel gently a couple of forces that were pushing against our DNA. 2 forces that challenged the idea that everyone can belong. Okay? I'm going to just talk about them briefly, 2 forces. The first was that of a social pecking order. Have you ever heard of this? Right? It is so natural for us to be tempted to judge ourselves in contrast to another person, right? In comparison to another person. We do it naturally. We do it unintentionally, but it is so natural to our broken, fallen nature to find ourselves on a pecking order. Now, we don't have to be at the top of the pecking order, but we sure don't want to be at the bottom of the pecking order, right? That's just the way I think, at least I'll speak for only myself. That's the way I think. I don't have to be at the top of the pecking order. I just don't want to be at the bottom of the pecking order. And so we have all these scorecards that we use to kind of rank ourselves in comparison with those around us. And churches are, church people are very sophisticated at this, right? And I can speak from that. I've been in church since I was born. My dad was a pastor. And the thing is, we can create our own scorecards so that we find ourselves somewhere in the pecking order where we want to be. And there's a lot of ways that we compare ourselves. Our families or our stories, what's my story compared to your story, my achievements versus your achievements, what do I own, what do you own, who do we know, what skills or abilities do we have. The Bible is often talking about this kind of stuff. 1 Corinthians chapter 12, we see these scorecards at work in the early church, people who were ranking themselves based on their giftedness and their abilities and what role they served in the church. And Paul is having to say, you know what? You're the one body. It doesn't matter if you're an ear or a foot or an eye. You are all one body. Don't sit there and think that one is more important than the other. You all belong to one another and to God. But this pecking order is nothing new to the church. Can I get real with you? In the first couple years of Hope Covenant, God brought a lot of young families and a lot of children, as I've shared already. Many of these people were new to the church, which was wonderful. That's why we start new churches. We didn't come to El Dorado to pull people from other churches and mess up the existing order of things. We came because oftentimes the gospel requires new expressions to draw people who are not yet connected to God. We had a lot of people coming who had very little church background or didn't know the Bible, hadn't been walking with God in any deep way, and we had very few people who had been part of a church, very few people who had spent much time in helping with ministries. And so Cheryl and I prayed those first couple of years, God, please send us a few families who have strong ministry gifts and who can help carry some of the load of ministry, because we had a number of people, but we didn't have a lot of leaders. And that was a real challenge. And I would get so excited some Sundays because people would come through the door who had clearly been part of a church ministry and clearly had giftedness and clearly had been in leadership. And I was thinking, God, thank you for bringing and answering our prayers for a few other leaders. And these were people who could come into the church and help lead a ministry. These were tithers. Pastors often don't talk about things like this, but actually it was important that we actually had people who were committed to helping support the ministry financially as well. Because here's how this new church started. And this is true of every covenant church plant, even to today. We needed financial supporters to be part of this church because we didn't have any money beyond what we were tithing and a small grant from the covenant church to help us get started with some startup funding. But this financial support was not going to last much beyond the first year in terms of keeping the church going. And so I was so relieved when God would bring these people who were not only gifted, but were committed financially to supporting the church. But not everybody who came and was a mature believer and was giving to the church came with pure motives. There were people who brought their scorecards. You know what I'm saying? New churches attract three kinds of people, by the way. They attract highly missional people. They attract a good deal of highly needy people. And then they attract these highly controlling people who were unhappy at the church that they were at and the church that they were at before that and the church they were at before that, and they see a new church and say, that's going to be the place where our wish dream can come true. where we can have a church. We'll come in and help shape it to be the church that we want, right? Highly controlling people. You ever met highly controlling people? So honestly, I am so grateful for every person that came through the door, but I will admit that I was frustrated with some people who came with their scorecards in hand. It was hard because they were convinced that they were on the top of the pecking order and had some divine right to see themselves as privileged in order to control the vision that God had for this church. And I understand this. I grew up in the church. I don't think I struggle as much, but I used to be highly judgmental toward people that had different ideas than me or had a different scorecard than me on the things that I thought mattered. The issue with people who came in and had a scorecard in one hand is that they never stayed more than a few months because Hope's DNA didn't cater to them. And that was very frustrating to me. In fact, we both stopped praying for God to bring us mature believers. We did. I'm not kidding. Because it was just too painful to see him come and then leave. Now, another force that challenged the DNA of our church early on was the preference that many of us have for personal comfort. And I will be the first one. If I'm given a choice between an uncomfortable situation and a comfortable situation, I'll pick the comfortable situation, right? It's just, why would you not? Most of us are comfortable when we are around other people who are very much like ourselves, right? That's why churches tend to be groups of people that are very similar to one another. The challenge is that if that's the case, if that's what the gospel call is, we are never going to be a church that reaches people that are different than ourselves, whose stories are different than ourselves, who speak a different vernacular, or whose politics are different than our own, or whose families are different, their stories are different than our own. And this was one of the realities that the early church also struggled with. Remember the Jewish church? The church that Jesus called into being, that the Holy Spirit empowered in Acts chapter 2, was a Jewish church. But the gospel, the good news, this call to belong to God burst far beyond the Jewish culture, far beyond the people of Israel. And suddenly there were Gentiles from all these different places in the known world who were responding to the gospel of Jesus. And they were coming into the church, and it was a challenge. When you read the book of Acts and so many of the letters to the New Testament, in the New Testament, you see again and again and again this conflict between the Jewish believers and the Gentile believers. The values that had been cherished by this Jewish community that were no longer relevant for everybody in every place. It was hard. The language was different. The customs were different. The scruples were different. When Hope Covenant was an infant, it was not the church in El Dorado where people would go to feel most comfortable if you were a church person. It just wasn't. I mean, there's some of you here today who might remember this, but, the first time you walked through the door of the Civic Center, you might have been greeted by a man with a cigarette in his left hand and shaking your hand with his right hand. That was true. You remember that? You might have heard some salty language in the lobby of the Civic Center that would make you think, are we actually in a church? You might have wondered, why in the world do we spend so much time and energy on bagels? What's the deal with bagels? We were known as the Bagel Church by some of our children. There were some messed up, crazy relationship families in this church that were just wonderful stories when you started hearing how God was using people to connect other people, to connect other people. People belonged. There wasn't a pecking order. There wasn't a scorecard. It wasn't always comfortable, however, for those of us who'd grown up in the church. But it was a place of life for so many. I think God gave this church, Hope Covenant, good DNA 18 years ago because it was gospel DNA. There's a lot of things that we probably could have done better if we would have thought it through more. But it was a place where there were no insiders or outsiders. And our American culture, I think, continues to present new challenges for the church. A lot of things have changed in 18 years. Our culture has continued to change. But one of the phrases that Cheryl and I have come to share with other new church planting teams. By the way, my day job, since I no longer serve this church, it's been about 9 years, I guess, since we stepped out of the pastorate of this church, and I help other covenant churches start. So I work with a lot of new church plants in a 5-state area. And one of the things we tell all of our other church planting pastors is that you never are going to plant the church you think you're going to plant, because it's God that's doing this thing. We do our best work, and then God kind of does what he's going to do. And I just want to close by sharing a little bit about a word that Dietrich Bonhoeffer, if you know that name, he was a German pastor in the run-up to the Third Reich, during the development of the Third Reich, and the oppression that the German church was feeling to conform to Hitler's kind of new cultural norms. And Bonhoeffer was one of those pastors pushing against this, realizing that our kingdom is not of this world. We answer to a higher God, right? And he wrote in his book, Life Together, these words. He says, "Every human wish dream that is injected into the Christian community is a hindrance to genuine community and must be banished if genuine community is to survive. He who loves his dream of a community more than the Christian community itself becomes a destroyer of the latter." And those words have stuck with me for 30 years since I first came across it. Because I have a wish dream for God's church. I want it to be this. And yet, if we love our wish dream more than the church itself, more than our sisters and our brothers, ourselves, more than our neighbors, and the community that God has called us to serve, we're going to destroy it, right? And so I pray that, I've prayed this all of my ministry. God, give me a heart for those who don't know you. Give me a heart for those who are different than me. And I'm not talking about people who have a great, huge difference. I'm talking about people who just carry a different scorecard in their pocket. Give me a heart for them. Break me so that I can love as you love. Hope was conceived as an imperfect community of Jesus where people were called to belong. And that requires standing at the foot of the cross and allowing Jesus to crucify our own wish dreams and our own pecking orders, our own scorecards, our own demands for comfort, so that we can be the bride of Christ. One day, Jesus is going to come back and restore all things. And his church is doing that work even now, being this community of reconciliation. I think our world today hungers desperately for this kind of community. I really do. I absolutely believe that. If I did not believe that, I would quit my job and do something else. But I believe our world is so hungry for the kind of community that Jesus died to create. And I believe Hope's Covenant's DNA continues to be centered on that kind of community. And I'm so grateful for all of you, many of you, again, whom I don't know very well at all, but God has called you to this community. I was talking to Paul out in the lobby earlier, and he said, this church has sort of had like 3 or 4 different lives over its short 18 years. And I said, yeah, that's probably true, isn't it? And that's fine. That's good. I think we're in a stage of life today with the church that every church needs to kind of rethink itself every few years so that we can be the salt and light for the community that exists around us. As Eric and the team come up and close us out today, I want to just invite you to pray with me. I'm looking forward to next month as we talk about Hope's Crazy Childhood. I hope you'll come back and we'll hopefully share. Well, actually, we got a little video we're going to share from our time down at the Civic Center, which will give you just a little glimpse again, not for nostalgia's sake, but just to kind of remember where we've come from. So thank you for being part of this church, for being part of 2021. We live between memory and hope, and we believe that God is going to use this church profoundly in the future as he has in the past. Lord, make it so. Help us to live into the DNA, which is really gospel, Lord, that you have called us to belong, not to be a place of insiders and outsiders, but a place of family through Jesus Christ. Amen.